on. Okay. Here we go. All righty.
Hi,
Hi, how are you?
doing well. You
Good.
you still snowed in there in Idaho or?
Well, actually, we're not too bad here. I'm actually glad I'm in Idaho and not upstate New York right now. They are really getting hammered this winter.
Wow.
So, yeah, we've gotten a little snow, but it's really, knock on wood, hasn't been
Yeah.
too bad.
Ruth, you do not have wood up there. You have a very very
Thank you.
well-functioning brain,
Well,
as I've been
sometimes
discovering
with
working through
enough
your book.
coffee. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Uh,
Well, so excited to chat with you.
by
Um,
the way, which book are you reading right now?
I'm reading the 2022 Cambridge one.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, good. I actually don't have my books haven't really caught up with me. I don't even have my books here, and I'm working with a newer computer that I don't think I have my book manuscripts on. So I'm
Oh,
kind of like, I don't have my books. So
I see.
anyway,
Well, if you need a copy of your book as a PDF, I can send it to you.
that's okay. I can get those sent over. It's one of the things I haven't gotten around to yet.
Right. Well, I had a chance to go back and revisit the seminar that we did with Tim Eastman a couple of years ago now,
Uh-huh.
including your contributions to that conversation and some dialogue with Michael Epperson. And um, it was very helpful to review all of that. And I'm almost wondering if there might even be a book there, just sort of it would
Hmm.
be a very dialogical
Hmm.
book, but with AI nowadays, I can get really good transcripts, and
Uh-huh.
much easier to work with an AI produced transcript to kind of clean up the language and turn it into
Hmm.
written form. So, anyways,
Oh,
just an
interesting.
idea. I haven't
Yeah.
spoken with Tim about it, but I was considering.
Okay. Well, yeah, now that's a really great idea. There's
Yeah.
all that material there, all that discussion
Hmm.
that certainly would, I think you're right. In thinking back, I think that was a really rich exchange, and there's a lot there that could be shared.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we could develop it further.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I've in thinking about this conversation with you, I've also been having conversations with a biologist named Michael Levin, who is exploring. He calls it Platonic morphospace, but it's a
Hmm.
version of the realm of possibility, and he's finding that he doesn't use these terms yet, but he's reaching out to philosophers like me to help. He doesn't think in terms of actualism and possibilism and whatnot, but he's basically trying to break through the actualist dogmas of um, biology, or the way that actualism has limited biology to these more reductionistic forms of explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
he thinks to explain morphogenesis and the development of individual organisms and regeneration of limbs in some organisms, that we actually need to make reference to a kind of field of possibilities that are being kind of harvested or reached into. He's not saying this is a quantum effect, but
Mm-hmm.
he's
Mm-hmm.
realizing that possibility has been left out. The causal role of possibility, not as an efficient cause necessarily, but maybe a formal cause, has been left out of biology. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've just been thinking about how across the natural sciences, not just in physics with your work, and Mike Epperson's work, and Stu Kaufman's work and others. And Kaufman's also doing this in biology, but you know, possibility is all of a sudden becoming this new territory, as it were, that science is exploring. So it's an exciting new frontier, I think.
Yeah, well, it's good. I mean, it's good to see this opening up a little bit. And of course, I was looking at the Whitehead material at the piece that you pointed me to. I've actually gotten through most of that and didn't get through the conclusion yet, but I can see how Whitehead really presaged so much of this in a sense with his what he called eternal objects, which I'm still kind of not feeling totally clear on that whole issue. I'm kind of a newbie as far as his project and the whole the whole project of constructing a metaphysics,
Mm.
which is not something I've really looked at. In my philosophical work has been just so narrowly focused on this esoteric area in quantum theory. So
Right.
it's kind of it's something that I need to get more oriented to kind of really be, you know, up to speed on the whole point
Sure.
of the enterprise. But clearly, from what little I've gotten so far, I do see him doing that. I do see him stressing the crucial role of possibility.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely. And
yeah.
I know that's a dense article, and it was really my attempt to better understand what he means by eternal objects. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I discovered in trying to do so that there are some what I perceive to be tensions in his own attempt to elaborate how they function. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can get into that, but he's trying to characterize the space of possibility and its relationship to space-time and actuality. And he's a mathematical logician, and so has this sort of Platonist tendency, but he's also a thinker of, creative evolution and irreversibility, and wants to make sure that these eternal objects are not uh, uh, cordoned off into some, you know, separate realm. He wants there to be bidirectional, uh, a relationship between what gets actualized and that has some effect on the realm of possibility, that they're not, even though he
Mm-hmm.
calls them eternal objects, there's this, I think, effort on his part to think how it may be possible for actuality to affect the ordering of these possibilities, just as the possibilities are affecting, what can be actualized. And so he wants, two-directional relationship there, but it's an asymmetrical relationship. Um, and mm, maybe we could just dive into this now because I think it's relevant. The issue in quantum physics between unitarity and non-unitarity. And I feel like, in unitarity, there's this sense of determinism and reversibility. And for Whitehead, that's an account of the space of possibility as a continuum, if we were to imagine it independent of actualization. Whereas non-unitarity is akin to what Whitehead is describing with concrescence. And so he would
Mm-hmm.
say, while possibilities are a continuum, actuality, he says, is incurably atomic. And he doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
atoms like Newton meant atoms. He means uncuttable whole, like
Discrete, yes, yeah.
indivisible wholes.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And so there's this element of discreteness that actualization brings, where you have all of a sudden location in space-time. And it's that interplay between the continuum of possibility, or what in quantum physics we would describe as unitarity, and the non-unitary actualization, the collapse, so to speak, where this asymmetry arises because, there's the universe has a history. Whitehead described it as there's a process of creative advance. And so this interplay between possibility and actuality gives rise to novel events,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so you get an evolutionary universe where there's a kind of irreversibility to time, right? Whereas if you just stay in
Mm-hmm.
the realm of possibility, it can seem like, I mean, maybe in like the many worlds interpretation, it's perfectly deterministic because every possibility is being actualized in some other actual world that we have no access to. Um,
Right. That's what you end up with when you are stuck with actualism.
right.
You get a bunch of different actual worlds and yeah.
So does that bridge
Mm.
work?
Well,
I'm
oh
trying to,
yeah. I mean when you're describing this, I'm like, yeah, totally. That's just totally lines up with my little, kind of tip of the iceberg, the iceberg sort of picture and the two different the levels of what I call quantum Lin, which does have these same attributes of that time, to the extent that there's sort of a temporal quality at all to this realm of possibility. It is a continuum. It's sort of time is kind of just a parameter that can be seen as arising from internal periodicity, of quantum systems, and it can be seen as a continuum. And then indeed with the non-unitarity does seem to line up really nicely with Whitehead's idea of concrescence and the transformation of this sort of elements of this realm of continuity to this atomistic actualized realm. And
Mhm.
it just like I'm hearing you say this, and I'm like, yeah, that's totally the picture. And there is an asymmetry to it, in the sense that there are so many more possibilities
Mm.
that are there that are available. They can't all be actualized for any given actual occasion, if you want to use his terminology.
Right.
So there's that aspect of kind of negation that you brought out in your piece of the
Mm.
constraint, the imposition of form, where you're saying no to certain things.
Mhm.
You're saying, well, no, I'm not going to do that because I got to have some definition here, some form, some limitation in order to have anything at all. And
Mm.
that's very much an attribute of this actualized realm,
Mhm.
the tip of the iceberg sort of space-time realm. So, yeah, I mean, I see a lot of parallel there. I mean, and
Yeah.
they are definitely there's a back and forth in that certainly once you have this actualization, um, that is going to have an effect on the systems, that I think of as that I see as being remaining in that level of possibility, but they are going to be undergoing change. They're going to be affected as a result of, what they participate in terms of actualization. And this is where I kind of, had to kind of struggle a bit with the idea of possibilities as eternal objects, and whether
Mhm.
that means if they're really unchanging. I don't see them as unchanging, but I see them as atemporal, in the sense that they're not within metrical time.
Right.
They're not in a domain that is characterized by metrical time, because that's kind of the tip of the iceberg thing. But I see them as undergoing some form of change. So that's where I kind of had to struggle with the idea of these as being eternal. If by that he meant really changeless, then you might have to look at, well, certain aspects of these objects could be seen as changeless, certain, essential properties of them, things like charge, things like the basic properties of the fields
Mm.
and so on. You could maybe find some eternal, unchanging aspects to those. But, as far as an atom, take an atom that's in, the substratum. So it's in this realm of possibility. So you could say it's atemporal in the metrical sense. It's going to be changing states. It's going to be, an excited state or in a ground state and so on. So it's going to be undergoing change in that sense. So again, it's just kind of, I'm not quite sure how
Yeah.
what Whitehead would say about that.
Well, there's that. I think I quote this enigmatic line that was actually recorded by a student of his during one of his Harvard lectures, which I wish he would have put in his published books. But he says that the truth casts the shadow, or actuality casts the shadow of truth back on the realm of eternal objects, which means um, when a concrescence occurs, when something is actualized, now all of a sudden we have the concept of truth becomes relevant, whereas in the realm of possibility, there are multiple contradictory, coexisting
Mm-hmm.
possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Like there needs to be that selection and limitation in order to arrive at something finite,
Mm-hmm.
um, and consistent that abides by, non-contradiction and these logical
Hmm.
rules. It's this or that, and
Right.
so so the shadow of truth cast back on actuality, cast the shadow of truth
Mm-hmm.
back on the realm of eternity and enriches the eternal objects. And so what he means by enrichment seems to be something like the eternal objects, though they have a definite or sort of essential character already, they're enriched in the sense that the relevance of that character vis-a-vis what's actually been actualized shifts, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So it's a
Interesting.
and it's a point in Whitehead that I am uncomfortable with because sometimes he does seem to cordon off and make static the eternal objects in a way that I'm uncomfortable with. So I'm glad that that's something you want to resist too, because
Mm-hmm.
Whitehead goes in different directions at different times on that question, I think. And
I see.
I very much want to go in the direction you do in interpreting what he's up to.
Okay. Well, I mean, that is such a cool statement because, you know, I don't, and I have to be kind of aware of, am I pushing Whitehead, too far? Am I pushing to him to where it'll line up as nicely as possible with my model? But if I do that, I mean, one way to interpret that is certainly in a quantitative sense in RTI, what seems to be required is that when you've got systems like atoms or something participating in measurement, that technically it's the photons that are doing the measurement. It's the electromagnetic field that is carrying out the measurement. And that's what the transaction is. But it has an effect on the emitters and absorbers, which are
Hmm.
these quantum systems with mass,
Hmm.
that they are affected by it in a way that they effectively kind of undergo collapse themselves. It's direct. The collapse is directly the basically where the photon ends up. So it's the field, the electromagnetic field that's technically directly collapsing. But there's an effective indirect collapse on the sources of the field, the emitters and the absorbers, so that they are effectively collapsed. And this is how measurement happens. So that if you have, an atom and people are doing something with an atom, say in a two-slit experiment, and they I want to measure where this atom ended up, and it effectively collapses, say, to one slit or the other or something like that, then then that's the sense in which a shadow has been cast on it, you could say.
Hmm.
You could say
Right.
that, okay, the photon is what really collapsed and there was an actualized event, but the shadow cast on the so-called eternal object or the atom is that in fact it got collapsed too. So that might be pushing it farther than Whitehead wanted to go, but certainly, that anyway, that's what the model, that's one of the aspects of the RTI model is
Right.
we're getting an effective collapse of these emitting and absorbing systems.
Yeah. And, there's a difference between Whitehead scholarship and exegesis of Whitehead and trying to apply Whitehead's ideas to contemporary physics and biology and science in general. And so I think, from my point of view, and I think you should feel this way too, whatever works that you can take from Whitehead, do it. It's not
Okay.
about necessarily,
Yeah.
we can be clear on what he said and what might be different about how you want to interpret it. But, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think we want it to be relevant, and 100 years have passed since he developed these ideas. So undoubtedly, the science has advanced. Quantum physics
Right.
is more or less in this, there's been this stalemate in quantum physics for so long that I think
Mm-hmm.
he still has a lot to tell us about how to think through the philosophy of nature, which is implied by these experimental findings. Um, that's another comparison that I wanted to offer to you between what you're doing and what he attempted to do with general relativity. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
where he offered his own alternative tensor equations and interpretation of um, Einstein's general relativity that involved flat space, not curved space. And he was modeling it on the sort of retarded potentials of electromagnetic waves. Um,
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
makes clear in his 1922 book, The Principle of Relativity, where he lays this out, that there's really this presupposes a different philosophy of nature than Einstein, which is precisely why Whitehead's approach wasn't really well understood um, as an alternative. And his specific tensor equations and his version ended up being slightly, he thought at the time it was identical in terms of empirical predictions to Einstein's version. It turns out that's probably not the case, but you could easily adjust
Mhm.
Whitehead's equations to bring them back into alignment. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
but the point is the different philosophy of nature. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of what I seem to have, recognized, and this came through in your conversation with Kurt Jai Mungal too, towards the end of that conversation, is that TI and the possibilist version of TI haven't been, especially the possibilist version, haven't been taken up by the physics community, not so much because, the formalisms don't work, because it seems like they do, but it's because the philosophy of nature is not the orthodox actualism, basically.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's part of the problem here is that there's this deeper philosophical set of philosophical assumptions that's holding physics back. And I think
Right.
you've discovered precisely what was philosophically missing from, say, Kramer's original version of this, um, where it seemed like retrocausality was implied. But by taking these transactions out of space-time and making it clear that this is in a different quantum realm where they're not traveling through space or forwards and backwards in time, um, then all of a sudden you're in a totally new universe, um, right? And
Mhm.
that has really fascinating philosophical implications that I'm interested in exploring.
Mhm.
But yeah, I feel like you and Whitehead are both meeting the headwinds of the stubbornness of this old natural philosophical paradigm.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, there's, it's very, very solidly entrenched.
Yeah.
And I know it's strangely, and this is really kind of surprised me, and I don't know if it's related or not, but I get an awful lot of flack about, and this has come up lately, and I've been ranting about it on Facebook a little bit,
Oh.
where people keep insisting um, the transactional interpretation is not really a different theory. They say they do this challenge show. Well, you say you've got a different theory, so show me an experiment crucis, that I can use to test it. And so there's this slide into this, like, seems to be this fundamental ignorance about what a theory is.
Yeah.
That people think theory means empirically distinct and in a novel prediction way. And I'm getting this from physicists too. I had this little exchange where
Mhm.
he repeated this, misconception about what a theory is, and he will not stand down on it. I finally kind of just
Yeah.
left it alone with him because he won't hear it. It's almost like I feel like these people know better, and I feel like that part of this is, I mean, I'm just kind of speculating and diagnosing here, and maybe not being fair, but I feel like this cultural entrenchment in this paradigm is having other symptoms of resistance, so that the pushback takes the form of lapses into like incompetence about what a theory is, that it's leading to like kind of in a form of irrational behavior where you're getting from philosophers of science and physicists this pushback based on not misconstruing what a theory is.
Yeah.
So it's like the resistance, if I'm overstating things, but it's the resistance takes not only forms of people saying, no, I don't like your theory, or like Kramer's, unnecessarily abstract dismissal kind of thing, but it seems to be taking the form of these double standards and weird, pseudo criticisms about, well, it's not really a theory because it doesn't. So yeah, it's just a bunch of sort of phenomena that I'm getting and out of arising out of that.
I
But
mean, the fact that you can't test it hasn't stopped string theory from, dominating institutions and
of course, do people say that's not a theory?
right,
And in fact, and of course, as I keep pointing out, the experiment crucis for TI is that it does predict measurement transitions and that you will get outcomes.
right.
So it's corroborated by the data, whereas the conventional theory fails to be corroborated by the data. And there are, that it cannot tell you, it cannot account for outcomes. So and sometimes I use the precession of Mercury as an analog, where the situation is similar to back in Newtonian gravitation, worked quite well, except there was an anomaly, the precession of the orbit of Mercury, which the theory failed to predict. So Einstein's theory, didn't necessarily have a novel prediction in that context, but it predicted what was presently an anomaly for the current theory, and that is corroborating. In other words, that's recognized. That was recognized in that context as confirmation of Einstein's theory over Newton's. So we have, I argue, a direct parallel in that the inability of the conventional quantum theory to predict outcomes, that we will get outcomes, is an existing anomaly for the theory, which TI remedies. And people can't hear that. They can't. And I said that to Mark, and it just bounced right off, and he said something non-germane about the Mercury issue. So the issue is it's basically a form of anomaly avoidance. So the conventional quantum theory is so entrenched that its inability to predict that we'll get outcomes is not even seen as an anomaly anymore. And it's basically the measurement problem, but it's like the measurement problem has been around for so long, and the attempts to solve it in the standard paradigm have been failures, that the cultural societal response has been to redefine it as not a problem and say it's not really a problem because the Born rule works. So that's what we're seeing now. And so in other words, they can say, well, I don't need to consider TI because I don't think there's really a measurement problem, or I think that that's not really a problem, which is what, for instance. So that's so that it's like to define away a problem. Well, this problem, we spent a century trying to solve it within the standard paradigm. We've all failed. So we'll redefine it as not a problem because all us smart people can't possibly have really failed at solving a problem. So, to get a little snarky about it. But that's what I'm seeing, I'm just seeing it, that it's now that there's a kind of a really prevailing tendency to kind of shrug it off.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like they're trying to have their cake and eat it in the sense that they want you to provide a falsifiable, that your theory would be falsifiable or provide some experiment that would prove it is proof. But then really what they want to do is they're refusing to theorize and falling back on instrumental interpretations.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
So
it's like a FAP thing. Well, it works FAP, and the Born rule works, and TI derives the Born rule, so it's empirically equivalent at the level of the Born rule. But again, this is like, and I just put a new fresh rant on my Facebook page.
I need to subscribe to your rants, Ruth. I don't know about this.
It's on Facebook, but where take two theories, the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT. Okay, well that's a theory that relates. It can, Newtonian gravitation is just F equals a bunch of stuff. It's an equation that relates force to mass and distance. So you can have the ideal gas law, say qualifies as a theory. So I have an equation relating pressure and volume to temperature. And I can use that to predict stuff. I can predict it, my volume goes down, my pressure will go up, and so on. So now let's have Maxwell's kinetic theory of gases. And these same people would have to say, well, that's not a theory. Okay. That's just an interpretation of Boyle's ideal gas law because it doesn't lead to any new falsifiable chain, prediction. It's empirically the same as Boyle's law. And I'm like, well, okay, but it explains where Boyle's law comes from. It tells you what's going on behind the scenes that's giving you the phenomena characterized by Boyle's law. And that's the position they're taking, essentially, that the objection they raise against TI, which I should call RTT now, but anyway, is this, to be consistent, they'd have to say, well, I'm sorry, the kinetic theory of gases isn't really a theory because Where's your falsifiable new novel prediction? Where is it different from my conventional theory? So
Right.
we got these, these strange double standards that clearly reflect incompetence, So anyway.
Well, just in institutional entrenchment and a need to, it's a paradigmatic turf war, and there is a scientific culture, or there are scientific cultures, and it's like professional guilds almost, that need
Mhm.
to keep a particular interpretation going, and to resist alternatives, because um, that becomes a funding competitor.
Of course, there are
Um,
these real world consequences, and people, and that's where we kind of stop doing real science and philosophy, and we start doing something else. And it's something that people fall into, but
but this
you know,
issue of, this comes up in metaphysics too, um, where, in like Sean Carroll has had a lot of debates with the philosopher Philip Goff about panpsychism.
hmm
And Carroll is always coming at Goff with this, um, what he feels is this refutation of panpsychism, which is, well, it doesn't, where's the new physics? Like, we have a complete understanding of particle physics, he says, which I think is an exaggeration, but, you know, what is adding experience or consciousness to atoms or photons or whatever? What does it change? Show me the experiment that would allow us that to make some difference. And that's to totally misunderstand the relationship between physics and metaphysics. Like, panpsychism
yeah.
be empirically equivalent as an interpretation to dualism, idealism, materialism. Like, the physics results would be the same. We're trying to understand uh,
hmm
what's going on behind what we can measure,
Of
which is
course, and you'd get a solution to the hard problem, maybe. I
exactly
mean, so it's a logical consistency.
right.
You can have a theory. I mean, this is where, I mean, in my really snarky moments, I say these people are so smart, but they cannot reason their way out of a paper bag
Mm,
because it's a logical point. And again, it's like saying, well, what is adding? Look, if I use the kinetic theory of gases, I still have Boyle's law. What do I need the kinetic theory of gases for? I can calculate how much my volume will increase if I, change the temperature. So what do I need the kinetic theory for? So, it's like it's a resistance to gaining insight by denying that one needs to gain insight, and just by reducing everything to empirical data, and using that as the standard for what kind of explanation is needed.
mhm,
So at least in that context, when you've got somebody who's, in kind of this materialistic actualistic paradigm, then it's like changing the rules of the game. So okay, you want to present an alternative theory to me, then my rules are the data is the same, your theory predicts the same data, so why should I pay attention to your theory? But on the other hand, if there was a theory that came along that didn't challenge their paradigm, then they might choose to opt for gaining new insight into what's going on. So it's
right.
like it's like the rules get changed depending on what's at stake.
And there's a neat symmetry here between the measurement problem and the hard problem of consciousness, in that the there are those who would want to pretend there is no problem in either case,
Exactly.
right? But if we
Exactly.
but if we want our understanding of quantum physics to line up with our experience of the macroscopic world, and how is measurement possible? But clearly this happens.
Mm-hmm.
Unitarity is broken. Um, it's similar to the issue of consciousness. Like, we could just pretend that there's nothing to be explained, which ends up being quite bizarre. It's these are both examples, I think, of Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right?
Hmm.
Where we pretend like we don't need to explain measurement, even though uh, the world that we live in is replete with uh, you know outcomes. Like we're constantly making decisions
Mm.
that are
Mm-hmm.
irreversible, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
of course there's possibilities that we're harvesting as well. But and I want to come back to the question of whether space-time actualization is just shadows on the cave wall. Put a pin in that for a second.
Okay.
But the hard problem is similar in that we're letting the models of physics and the models of biology and psychology stand in for our actual experience of being sentient, alive, awake,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
unconscious, and turning what is, as Philip Goff's always reiterating, our most intimate interface with the world, our the what we know most directly is our unconscious experience.
Right.
But we're putting these models in place of that and then pretending that we don't have any conscious experience, so there's nothing to explain. Just as I think,
Yeah, it's very bizarre.
yeah,
I mean, to me, it's almost a neurological disorder. It's almost like a mental illness, you know. It's just yeah, and I think the part of the problem is that our own intimate experience of our own consciousness is not an empirical matter. It's not something anyone can corroborate. I mean, I always point people back to, the Ghost Boy. There's this book called Ghost Boy that was written by a guy named Martin Pistorius, who had, what's it called? He
lock,
was completely paralyzed.
locked in syndrome.
Yes, locked in syndrome, and he eventually miraculously recovered because one caregiver somehow recognized there was somebody in there. And everyone assumed, because there's no empirical demonstration of what we think of as a conscious person, that he wasn't conscious. And the whole time he was conscious. And so later he was, yeah, I was, all they did was play Barney cartoons for 12 years and it drove me insane. So that's the point, is that it's there's a schizophrenia that kind of happens, that these people are such hardcore empiricists that if something is not empirically corroboratable, in this third party sense, they view it as not there.
Hmm.
They're it's like a hardcore empiricist stance. If it's not empirically detectable and corroboratable, therefore it's not scientific by definition. So they treat their own experience as not scientific, and they dismiss it as something not subject to scientific inquiry, and they kind of cordon it off.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of a pathology.
Yeah, it could be. Um, okay, let's let's transition. I wanted to ask you about some things you said in
Mm-hmm.
that interview with Kurt,
Mm-hmm.
Theories of Everything, which I really enjoyed. Um, well, first of all, I loved your comment that physics needs to take its mechanistic training wheels off. I think that speaks to a lot of, the hangups that we've been just discussing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where the physics community is by and large afraid to ride the bike,
Mm-hmm.
find its balance without these old actualist,
Mm-hmm.
mechanistic,
Yeah.
deterministic models.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you also described, you used Plato's allegory of the cave to describe the difference, as another image that you use in addition to the iceberg. Use Plato's cave to describe the difference between quantum possibility and space-time actuality, where you describe space-time as you describe shadow objects on the space-time cave wall, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and this sounds to me a bit like what I'm not sure if you're familiar with Donald Hoffman and his work on like cognitive agents, and he's always saying space-time is doomed, space-time is an illusion, space-time is a construct. And I think he's onto something, but um, I also wonder the if the what we really want to say is that our experience of, you know, being bodies in space-time, say, is just an illusion, or if it's only part of the picture that becomes illusory if we think it's all the picture or the whole picture.
I think the latter, that's what I would say. That, I
Yeah.
mean, I haven't read Hoffman's work in detail, but from what I've seen I think he takes it a little too far. I
Mhm.
mean, and it's this is a side point, but he'll say reality isn't real. He'll say things like that. I'm like, what are you talking about? So,
Right.
Um, so there's certainly something real, and I think there's more of an illusory component to our, what we think our relationship to space-time is.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a matter of interpretation, how one interprets literally the space-time construct. It's a matter of interpretation, but the bare bones ontology again for me is that all space-time really is a structured set of invariant events, which aligns really with what Einstein said about it.
Yeah.
So now the events are not substances, they're not they're sort of activities. They're, like what Whitehead said, they're occasions, so they're not things. And so one could argue, well, like Hoffman, one could say, well, then they don't really exist. It depends what you mean, what your ontology, what your
Right.
definition is.
Exactly.
But for me, they have a structural character, so I see that structure as having some ontological import. But
Mm.
again, our perception that we think we are bodies in this space-time container, that is what I think is illusory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, it's more like, I mean, I think the online role-playing game is really a kind of a nice
Mm.
analogy, and I only know about it because my daughters are avid gamers, So, that you've got a user interface. And so the what we think of as our existence in space time is really just kind of a user interface. And it's the mistake is to think that we are the avatar in the game, to think
Mm.
that aspect of us that uses the point of view is actually in some domain when it's simply kind of a view screen, and you're not really in it. It's sort of an interface between you and the other objects.
Right.
So and
Yeah.
that
I think that tracks quite well with not with Einstein, but also Whitehead, who in some ways was just trying to be even more relativistic than Einstein was, in saying that, yeah, events aren't things. Um,
mm-hmm,
events aren't point instants either. Uh,
mm-hmm,
their durations or regions is another term, that Whitehead would use. So we have to get beyond point based geometry in Whitehead's approach to,
mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well, technically completely, yeah, that they are
and
not, yeah, they're not points.
right.
they're
And
they're finite emission
so,
absorption, yeah.
but so not only are events not things or points, but space time is not a thing. It's a network of events, in Whitehead's
Exactly.
terms, right?
I mean, you could call them happenings, they're
Mhm.
verbs in a sense.
Right.
So I don't, that's where I kind of, I don't like non-fingo, do the Newton thing. Like I'm not gonna hypothesize as to like what this ontology is simply because I don't mind leaving that to others. I
Yeah.
just kind of go, well, I see there's a structure there. I'm not going to purport to know what it is, in an ultimate sense,
Right.
and I'm happy to follow if someone has a proposal that's more specific than that.
Yeah.
You
Well, I don't have the mathematical
know.
or physics chops to do this, but I was wondering about how, Whitehead's account of gravitation in terms of, retarded wave potentials,
Mm-hmm.
you add the other side of the coin to that. So not just, the offer waves, but the confirmation waves. If building on Whitehead's approach to gravity might help with, I know you've already done so much work on a relativistic
Mm-hmm.
expansion or extension of the transactional approach, but it seems to me that if we fully, if we get rid of the idea of space-time as some kind of a substance or a block,
Mm-hmm.
which sometimes Einstein seems to suggest something like that.
He falls into the Minkowski thing. Yeah, he
Yeah,
does.
that
Yeah.
that and
He was
Whitehead.
struggling.
Well, of course, it's
Yeah, he went through a lot
okay.
of evolution, just trying to struggle
Right,
with it.
right.
But yeah, no, I mean, I have not looked at that in detail yet, and that is something I've been wanting to do. And in fact, I should say, as far as chops, I don't really have much GR chops. The person who does is my colleague Andreas.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting with that. But that's something, that I could run past him and say, Andreas, but it'd be nice. I mean, I can certainly take a look at it and get some general sense of, where he was going with that.
Right,
Because I totally agree that, the Minkowski take, the spatialization of time and all of that is a mistake.
right. Yeah.
So I think we can use some input from Whitehead on that.
So in Whitehead's framework, he has his actual occasions, which are events. You can call them space-time events if you want, but they're also dipping into quantum land in your terms. So they're not just
Hmm.
space-time events.
Right.
Because and the way that he allows an actual occasion to bridge between the realm of possibility and the realm and actuality is he says they're dipolar. There's a physical pole and a mental
Hmm.
pole,
Hmm.
or there's physical prehension and what he calls conceptual prehension. And so he's not a dualist, but he's a dipolarist, if you want. He thinks in terms of these polarities. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so the physical pole of an actual occasion is what locates it in space-time, because a newly arising or concressing occasion is inheriting its past, and it has to
Hmm.
conform to the spatiotemporal structure of that past, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But in the mental pole, each occasion of experience is also um, in touch with quantum possibility, you could say.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what the process of concrescence is describing is the way in which the already actualized past that an occasion has to conform to in its physical pole can be integrated with the available set of possibilities that could be realized in the next moment, right? And it's not exactly, I've been trying to see how this maps onto the idea of an offer wave and a confirmation wave, because there's a similar dipolarity, I feel like, in the transactional interpretation.
Hmm.
And I'm tempted to want to not make an equivalence, but at least relate, you know, Whitehead's physical pole with space-time actuality, and then his mental pole with uh, quantum land, with quantum process and the exploration of possibilities. And so every actual occasion is an integration or a decision or a collapse of the wave function, you could say, that's integrating these two aspects, past and future, or past and possibility, if you prefer. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I wonder, just at first blush, and I know there's so much more to Whitehead's such a Baroque metaphysician in a way. Once you get the basic logic of his system, I think it's quite elegant, but there's just a lot of moving pieces initially. So, but I
Hmm.
wonder at first blush, what you think about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I that does sound like an alignment to me. Um, of course, I'm always hesitant to specifically bring in mental aspects,
Yeah,
just because I get enough flack just from doing
sure.
doing physics differently. But in insofar as the mental pole is sort of identified with the level of possibility,
Right.
and I completely align with having it rather than past and future, past and possibility.
Mm.
That's definitely how I describe it, like, and have to say Eckhart Tolle also will say things like the so-called future, because the idea of the future as something that exists is kind of an
Right.
actualist
Right.
assumption, block assumption. So in the same way as existing in the same way as the past, you
Hmm.
know.
Right.
So I do see this asymmetry
Right.
between the past as something that constrains, as you said, constrains what we might call the physical pole.
Hmm.
And we can even think of that in terms of the shadow on the shadow that was cast, that has been
Right.
cast on, to mix the sort of the perspectives, or mix the language. The shadow that cast on, say, the absorbing atom. Okay, well, it was in a ground state. Now it is in an excited state. So some shadow has been cast on it, and it now is constrained by the fact that it has a particular well-defined state, and
Mhm.
that dictates, whether it's going to emit an offer wave at any particular time, and with some probability. So it has that anchor in a sense that we could identify with the physical pole. And then there is in play this level of possibility where, the typical case is that there are a bunch of other eligible potentially absorbing atoms. So we have this indeterminism, we've got this many possibilities, and then ultimately one becomes concretized where there's a collapse. So, and I have kind of suggested that volition might come in here. So that's kind of the farthest I've sort of dipped my toe into this idea of mental pole, is suggesting that there's an opening for free will there, in the fact that you've
Right.
got all these competing possibilities, and you might appeal to volition to explain why one of them gets actualized.
Yeah. I mean, I totally understand your resistance to bring in the mental, because you have such a heavy lift trying to convince people of the transactional interpretation without, all of a sudden saying mind is involved. Because I mean, on the one hand, being able to explain measurement without saying consciousness collapses the wave function is one of the,
Mm-hmm.
really important aspects of the transactional interpretation, because that consciousness, giving consciousness so much ability, just strikes me as it's just too idealist, like the moon's not there when we're not
Mm-hmm.
looking or something,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
that it's spread out in some field of probability and it doesn't acknowledge decoherence. And anyways, so I totally understand why you're hesitant. And this is an issue with Whitehead's um, approach to metaphysics, because he's explicitly trying to generalize our human understanding of things like feeling and emotion and consciousness, experience, etc., to generalize and to distill down the most basic form of experience, say, or feeling,
Mm-hmm.
so that it would apply at all scales in nature. And this is the general, panpsychist move. So we avoid having
Mm-hmm.
to have consciousness be a rabbit pulled out of the hat at some later stage
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
evolution of the physical world.
Yeah.
But at the most generic level, mind for Whitehead very much is just, or conceptual prehension, is all about the searching of possibility. And it can be hard and feel anthropomorphic at first to say that quantum systems are making decisions. But if decision just means a cutting off of a whole array of possibilities to arrive at one outcome,
Mm-hmm.
what better word do we have to describe?
That it's a choice in a very rudimentary sense. And physicists have said that,
Right.
you know.
Because
Now,
there's no
they might say, well, I was just speaking metaphorically, but some of them really do go on record and say that, So
right. So, I mean, if I
yeah.
understand that the transactional interpretation allows us to account for how you go from um, possibility to probability with some
Uh-huh.
limited
Exactly.
probability outcomes, but there's no real explanation for why one of those probabilities would be chosen, because that's the free choice, right? There's something about
Mm-hmm.
nature. Quantum physics in this interpretation is revealing something about nature that is at least distantly analogous to what we would want to think of as freedom at the human level.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly in the sense that it is not predetermined what's going to happen.
Right.
So that there's truly, so to speak, a garden of forking paths.
Mm,
I mean, another the little bit of the minefield, just to kind of,
yeah.
clue you in on the other aspect, though, that I have to be careful of here, is that there that you get the following double standards. So for instance, even within the standard paradigm, the conventional approach to physics, people have things like the Higgs mechanism, whereby they claim that this is how you get mass in quantum field theory, when it looks like your particles should not have any mass, and it's this so-called Higgs mechanism. Now, this theory involves something happening to the basic field so that it becomes it gets a new state of the field, a new ground state that's infinitely degenerate, meaning you've got an infinity of ground states that the theory says, okay, well, this Higgs mechanism thing, I'm going to have this weird symmetry breaking, and I'm going to get an infinity of ground states, and nature will pick one. And they don't think they have to explain that. They don't
Mm.
think they have any problem, with the Higgs mechanism in the sense that they are presented, the theory gives them an array of solutions, a multiplicity of equally good solutions. And then there's only one in nature. And that
Mm.
is directly analogous to the collapse. See, so what I'll get is he's saying, but you haven't explained how we get this one outcome out of your. Did they say that about the Higgs mechanism? No.
Right.
So this is why this is one of the reasons I have avoided saying, oh, well, we have to attribute mind to quantum systems. I have specifically avoided saying that
Mhm.
because this is a tactical decision on my part because
Yeah.
then I'll give them more ammunition. The ammunition will be, oh, you have to bring in mind to explain your solution to the measurement problem. See, that's what they'll do.
Yeah.
Whereas they don't think they have to do anything to explain that nature just picks one ground state in the Higgs mechanism.
Right.
Same kind of situation, right? They say spontaneous symmetry breaking. So that's why I say, okay, well, it's a weighted spontaneous symmetry breaking then.
Nice.
And
Yeah.
that's only to not give them the tactical, an extra instrument to.
I totally get that. Yeah, I'm
And it's
not trying to.
unfortunate, because I don't want to foreclose. And that's why I have said, by the way, an alternative approach is to allow
Yeah.
that there's some volition. But I never want to bring it in as, oh, this is my explanation, because I don't think I should have to, guys. You don't think you have to explain the Higgs, thing.
Right. I don't want to give anyone
Yeah.
ammunition to dismiss what you're doing. So you let me say it, and they can attack me for it. Uh,
Sounds good. Okay.
um, speaking of the Higgs and like high energy physics in general, and all the money going into particle accelerators and whatnot, I don't know if you saw Sabine Hassenfelder's recent rant about. She read an email that she didn't name who sent it to her, but someone in high energy physics complaining about an article she had in Nature that was saying that a lot of high energy physics is basically um, bullshit, and
Mm-hmm.
that they're not actually um, advancing physics. They're just coming up with a bunch of math and reasons to spend more billions on particle accelerators to not actually learn anything that
Mm-hmm.
be of value. And she's very
Mm-hmm.
outspoken about this, and
Yeah.
it speaks to some of the institutional issues we were talking about earlier. Um, I don't know. Are you familiar with Sabine Hassenfelder? Do you know?
Yeah, and I've met her, and the reason I've kind of don't really follow her that much is because she's one of these people who has purported to be interested in TI, and then just I gave her she invited me to a conference, a workshop, and I gave like a 1 hour talk, and then later she wrote some paper arguing for her hidden variable
Um,
super deterministic approach and
oh, right.
caricaturing TI in terms of the 1986 version and
And
pretending like I never said a thing.
didn't at all hear what you
No,
brought.
it just never, no,
Uh,
she put up a straw man.
that's
She,
unfortunate.
So, I mean, I agree with her. I've quoted her on other things. She said like, um, closely held philosophical convictions are getting in the way of progress. I've quoted her on that. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I agree with her criticisms, in terms of, and what you just described. But I don't read her papers anymore because she just doesn't stay up. She doesn't get up to date on topics that don't support her own preferred, model.
Yeah. Well, common story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so going back to the comparison I was making with Whitehead's actual occasion
Mm-hmm.
and TI, there's an interpreter of Whitehead's work, Belgian philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers.
I've heard the name, yes. Uh-huh.
She wrote this wonderful book, um, gosh, over 10 years, maybe 15 years ago now, called Thinking with Whitehead, um, which is just about as hard as reading Whitehead directly. So I don't recommend
Mm-hmm.
it as a secondary source to introduce people to Whitehead, but she worked
Okay.
with Ilya Prigogine on some of his chemical experiments that
Mm.
eventually, he won a Nobel Prize for in non-equilibrium thermodynamics. But anyway, she describes Whitehead's actual occasions as stitches, and it's very much like your metaphor of
Mm.
the weaving of
Mm.
space-time.
Totally.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so she says each, the process of actual occasions unfolding in this creative advance is a process of inheritance and transition from one occasional stitch to the next stitch, and these stitches are weaving together what we call space-time. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so physical space-time measured by that can be measured is a consequence of the decisions of actual occasions that have now become past. Um, it's a result of how they've stitched the past together with the future through the medium of the present. And so, the Whitehead's account of concrescence is all about what he thinks is most concrete and what science very easily and philosophy loses track of. What's going on in the present moment, which is where we always are,
Right.
is this stitching together of the actualized past with possibilities. And of course, what becomes actualized in the past is always going to change our perspective on possibility from the present, right? Because we have to
Mm-hmm.
connect with the
It's going to
present.
condition,
It's going to condition how
condition.
how those
Mm-hmm.
possibilities appear to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is Whitehead's account of this makes clear that there's an asymmetry here, but also that these eternal objects, which is his unfortunate term for the definiteness of the possibilities in that realm of res potentia, that there is a constant movement and shifting of how at least how those possibilities appear to us in the present, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in my paper that you read, I tried to say there's something like a quantum measurement problem here, where even if there were some definiteness to the realm of possibilities before an actual occasion tried to prehend them, we couldn't know anything about it. We only know that realm as we interact with it
Mm-hmm.
in the present from our in our situation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's almost like, do we even need to ask the question, what are the eternal objects independent of actual occasions? They're never independent of actual occasions. They're always
Hmm.
arrayed to some actual occasion from its perspective, right? And reordered relevant to that perspective.
Well, here's where I would have to kind of ask the question, uh, and kind of point to maybe the distinction between epistemological
Yeah.
access and ontology. And I kind of what's interesting is it seems like Whitehead's part of Whitehead's mission is to almost kind of meld those two
Yep.
as a solution to the problem of truth and so on.
Mhm.
I put some comments in your paper, so maybe when I'm done, I'll send them to you and see. You can see I have a few questions and maybe some observations that might be not on target. I don't know, but that was kind of the way it struck me, and I see that that's a valid effort, but I also am leery of identifying what can be known with what exists.
Oh yeah,
So
sure.
that's where I get a little bit. I don't know. Maybe that's part of his, the function of his eternal objects is to allow that there's something there, whether we know it or not. That something there underlying the ontology, whether or not we know about it, but the fact that we could become aware of it means that it must exist. I don't know. It's just one way to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you have, another 20 minutes or so, I'd be happy to talk about the paper. But
Yeah. Oh, sure. Well, yeah, I have more time, but I want to make sure I know you had some specific questions. So,
yeah, I'm just
yeah.
rolling. I've just been rolling through them. But on this point, you're
Okay.
right. as Whitehead puts it basically this way, he says he wants his metaphysics to be an account of what there is, ontology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he wants his account of what there is to be known to reveal also how it is that we can know. So that the nature of uh, reality as being composed of these actual occasions, he says, that giving an account of what those actual occasions are also explains how something like knowledge is possible for
Mm-hmm.
those actual occasions that are realized in the stream of consciousness of a human being, a scientist, right? And so he doesn't want knowledge to be something, or consciousness to be something sort of extraneous, or that we explain separately from our explanation of the kinds of things that there are in
Mm. Right, right.
the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tall order for modern philosophers, because we're so used to, after Kant, and I mean really after Descartes, making on epistemology first philosophy. In other words, always beginning with what we can know,
Mm-hmm.
and not realizing that we are beings that exist in the world first.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a
Yeah,
Kantian perspective, it's like, okay, yes, the mind is organized in such a way that we can only perceive and understand the world in terms of that filtering and that organization, right?
right.
But where did these human minds come from in the first place?
Of course.
How did they get here?
Yeah,
And now we have evolution to account for that. But if we
yeah.
do want to understand mind in an evolutionary way, then there's got to be some continuity that goes all the way down, right?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I always get annoyed when people want to start with epistemology and pretend that, I would say pretend that what they can know defines what exists. I'm like, whoa,
Yeah.
what made you so important? To me, it's sort of like the blind man and the elephant, there's that metaphor. And to me, it's like the blind man saying, well, I'm able to detect, hey, there's the wall. So that means walls can exist. I'm like, wow, the elephant doesn't need you, buddy.
Right.
So that's what
Right.
kind of react negatively to that. I'm like, well, maybe there's an elephant there. If there's an elephant there, he doesn't really need any of the blind men to exist. And then the question of the blind men, yes, developing theories about the elephant based on what their
Yeah.
capabilities are makes perfect sense,
Right.
right? And I agree there needs to be some account of how that works.
Mm.
But just from starting with saying, well, what I can know about detects what exists. I'm like, what? Why did
Yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean, this epistemology first thing is also related to, the demand for empirical evidence, of TI or something, because
right.
there's a people who argue like that are neglecting the fact that um, empiricism as a methodology presupposes all sorts of things about the nature of reality, and begs the
Mm-hmm.
question about induction. How is induction possible? How do we make inductive judgments about the future?
Mm-hmm.
This is a notoriously sticky problem in the history of philosophy and epistemology. And if you don't have some account of the nature of what there is that explains how there could be these general patterns that justify our inductive judgments about how nature
Mm-hmm.
operates,
Mm-hmm.
you're just assuming a lot. You can't just be an empiricist. You have to explain how empiricism is possible, or
Of
to
course.
how empirical knowledge is possible.
Right. And of course they don't want to do that because that I don't know. I mean, then I guess Bishop Berkeley did that and ended up with
Mm,
anti-realism. So
right. And yeah,
yeah.
um, there are better and worse, more and less adequate philosophical approaches to these questions. And
Mm-hmm.
I think adequacy is, one of the criteria we would use to assess the validity of a metaphysical scheme. Um, it would, adequacy not just to our everyday experience, but to the empirical findings of scientific experiments. Like we want,
Mm-hmm.
obviously we want our metaphysics to not conflict. But the problem is
Hmm.
there's always way more theories than what to interpret the same set of data. The data don't determine the theory.
Right.
There are
Right.
other considerations that need to be brought into the picture. So do you want I'd be curious to hear your confusions or questions
Yeah, let me just,
about the
I
picture.
could look at some of these. Let's see. Um, okay, well, I think you kind of helped me a little bit with, my concern about eternal objects, that maybe, that's partly a semantic issue. Let's see. Okay, I guess one thing that might be fun to consider is looking at on page 16 when you were talking about Dewey
Yeah.
and Whitehead. In the bottom, towards the bottom, page 16, Whitehead secures truth as correspondence with precisely the same metaphysical machinery he uses to embed experience in nature. Eternal objects function as mediators between our physical percepts and mental concepts, um, and so on. The thoughts occurred to me that is this a kind of a semiotic function here?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is he thinking of eternal objects as symbols in some sense? I
Or
don't know.
signs, at least.
Yeah, uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah.
Um, okay,
I think that would
okay.
be, I mean, this came up actually in the seminar series with Tim Eastman,
Oh, uh-huh.
where, Tim's trying to bring together Whitehead and Peirce, and
Ah,
they're both Charles Saunders Peirce, who develops, this triadic account of semiosis,
mm-hmm,
whole semiotic logic. And there's so many convergences between Peirce and Whitehead, but they're also each of them is so sophisticated in their thinking, and to make translations is like we would need, several generations of philosophers and scientists to actually make that translation. But I think,
mm-hmm,
speaking loosely, that yeah, the function of eternal objects is something like the way that signs function um,
mm-hmm.
in Peirce.
So, yeah, and I guess that's where I kind of struggle a bit with the ontological status
Mm,
of these, but well, why not? I mean, just because I guess I'm coming from a context in which I'm usually thinking of ontology in physical terms,
hmm
and to broaden that and say, to reify signs. Okay, well, why not? That in order to function in this way, that something has to exist. If it doesn't exist, it can't really function.
mm,
So I don't know, but this is where I get a little bit challenged, by my habitual kind of context to, physical theory and so on.
right.
And where
So
where yeah.
Whitehead has this idea of, he calls it the extensive continuum, which is a
Hmm.
sort of field of potential, and the space-time of our universe would be one special form of that extensive continuum. But the extensive continuum itself for Whitehead is you could say, a complex eternal object that is constantly being uh, re reorganized by what the actualities that emerge out of it and then pass back into it
Mm-hmm.
as a past accumulates, as the truth casts a shadow back on that
Mm-hmm.
realm of eternal objects. But that extensive continuum he describes as having certain truly eternal rules of, he calls them rules of extensive connection, which have to do with the relations of wholes and parts, and how we define when something's overlapping with something else. And that he thinks that before you can even get any specific metric, any specific geometry of space-time, you have to have these basic rules in place. And
Mm-hmm.
he's very cautious in process and
Mm-hmm.
reality, but he says, if we were going to have actual metaphysical knowledge of anything, where metaphysical knowledge would mean, you know, the propositions that we're uttering are true of any cosmos that there could be. He thinks that it would have something to do with these rules of extensive connection.
Hmm.
Um, but he says, I'm not sure if I've arrived at those rules. I probably haven't, but this is my, he takes a stab at it. Um,
Mm.
and so that, that those rules of extensive connection are part of what um, leads to the requirement of a confirmation to the past and the physical pole, that there's something inescapable um, about how each novel actual occasion has to physically prehend the already actualized past. And it's not determined by
Hmm.
the past
Yeah,
because there's also the mental
it
pole.
has to take it into account.
It has to
It has
take it
to
into
take it
account.
into account.
And
Well, I
so,
mean that I'm seeing a lovely parallel here with basically the conservation laws.
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, um, in a very, flat-footed physics sense, we at least we could say, in the most in the grossest sense possible, an example of eternal rules would be the conservation laws, because these really, in the
Mm,
RTA picture, apply to the quantum level.
interesting.
The conditions for will you get offers and confirmations. The key, an important rule, not the sole consideration, but an important conditioning rule is the conservation. Will the conservation laws be satisfied
Hmm.
in order
Interesting.
to get
Yeah.
anything to happen?
So, Whitehead speaks to that actually, and he doesn't want to say that his account of concrescence is contradicting conservation laws, but he does refer to the way in which the mental pole functions by, he says, diverting the flow of energy. Um,
Hmm.
so not introducing new energy that wasn't there, not creating energy or destroying it. But he refers to the diversion of the flow of energy, so that if we imagine um, energy flow as having this dipolar transition occurring in each moment, each actual occasion, um, there's there's not determinism in the way that energy flows, right? There's actually
Hmm.
room for a diversion that's still consistent with conservation laws and consistent with the past, but you know there are always multiple probable outcomes, and one gets decided,
Hmm.
and
That's collapse.
that's collapse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I hadn't made that. I think that that's a good bridge here with conservation laws. I'm glad you threw that into the mix.
Yeah,
Um,
because they are conditioning a constraints, but they don't determine what's going to be actualized. They
mhm,
they they simply, condition. That's how I think they tie in with the anchoring of the physical pole in the sense with the past, because whether you're going to have a new stitch or not depends on whether those laws can be satisfied by way of your stitch that you're going to make. So that conditions, the making of that stitch according to what's already happened in
right,
that sense, that it doesn't uniquely determine what that new stitch will be. So that latter aspect can be seen as, when he says diverting the flow of energy, I mean, if he means, that we have a genuine, that where that flow is not a deterministic flow,
right,
which it isn't at the quantum level, then
right,
then it does align with the idea that you've got, in general, multiple absorbers in play, and then one of them gets it. So you
right,
get a clear directionality that
hmm,
was not predetermined.
right, right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's where I would go. I mean, I was trying to soften your concern about eternal objects functioning as mediators like that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea there is that, when he refers to eternal objects that the physical pole is physically prehending, those are, um, say, measurement outcomes that have already, and that's already the collapses which have already occurred, that are definite, determinate even. And,
Mm-hmm.
how is it that the past can be present without being the same as the present? That's the metaphysical problem here.
Mm-hmm.
right? And so eternal objects function in this mediating role by allowing the past to be present as a potential, as a real potential. He makes the distinction between real potentiality and pure potentiality. Eternal objects already actualized in the past in the form of definite outcomes are real potentials that,
Okay.
that can be physically prehended by the presently concurring occasion, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
the distinction between eternal objects and actual occasions is his attempt to resolve this problem of how the past can be present without being the same as the present. How do you distinguish the two? Well, you say the past is now a real potentiality for the present,
Mm-hmm.
and it's conforming to a lot of that, but there's also, um, for the mental pole, if not pure potentiality, then at least far more um, possibility than what's being received in the physical pole, right? And
Okay, so we could almost think of then the following correspondence, which may or may not be right, but we can play with it, is that the offer wave aspect corresponds to the what he would call the real potential of the past,
Mhm.
and that the confirmations are kind of could be seen as the pure potentials
Okay.
in the sense that they have
Yeah.
more freedom. You know, they're interacting with that offer wave and they're relating to it, but they have more freedom in terms of the multiplicity of possibilities
Right.
than that offer wave does. So we might play with that as a correspondence there.
I like that. Yeah. Okay. I think there's something there.
Yeah, that's helpful to me because I mean, where I just feel like I'm so lost at sea with Whitehead's terminology. He's got all this terminology. I'm like, well, what does that mean? What is that? And
Yeah.
and I'm just one of these people. I'm like, just give me an example.
Yeah. Yeah.
just so. But that's been how you've helped a lot with that kind of giving me some examples and some you know situations that show how these things function.
Yeah. I mean, metaphysics is so hard because it's so abstract and
Hmm.
concrete examples are hard to come by.
Of
Uh,
course, but if
and
it if you can show how it functions to
yeah.
to relate
Yeah.
concepts, even that's helpful.
It's much
So,
more fun and productive for me to talk to a physicist and a philosopher of physics than to argue with other metaphysicians because it very quickly just arguing with other metaphysicians about this stuff, it just spirals off into abstraction and it's very hard to keep it grounded. But
hmm
in
hmm
relating it to physical theory, um, I feel like there are more anchors to see, well, how does this actually change our understanding of physical ontology, like you're saying?
hmm hmm
Um, and in making those bridges, we can then start to say things that go beyond the remit of physics about, for example, where does mind fit into this picture?
hmm
So yeah, this is a much even more productive conversation so far than I was imagining.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, I'm learning a lot too. So, yeah, I just trying to find more time to get into Whitehead. So your piece came along at a good time for me, and this conversation is really helpful.
Great.
So yeah.
Um, I have a few more minutes. I don't know if there was
Okay.
another,
Yeah, I have a couple more minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
was there another question or
Oh,
anything to take away from
actually,
it?
looking back at this, I think you really resolved a lot of,
Hmm.
my concerns about those so-called eternal objects. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I feel like
So
this paper opened up more issues with eternal objects than it resolved, but I'm glad it was partially
that's
clarified.
okay. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, so I see that, and I just think I threw something in. Okay. Where was that? Okay, that is not a big deal. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Oh yeah, I guess just maybe a little minor quibble here about his use of the term feeling that
Hmm.
kind of made me a little uneasy. Like when he says, I guess you quoted him on, or paraphrased him on page 10, where pre prehension is a process of feeling.
Hmm.
I agree that, like it's like pre-analytic and so on. And I just commented here that this seems to me to restrict prehension to a particular class of subjective experiences, which seems too limiting to me. Isn't perception, which seems an aspect of prehension, distinct from feeling?
Hmm.
So I guess I just maybe in this just kind of gets a yellow flag reaction for me because if I talked about feeling, I would get,
Sure.
tomatoes thrown at me. But um,
Right.
yeah, so I mean, for me, the whole role of prehension that I liked so much about Whitehead in terms of this is very, this is kind of the yin gets to the response and so on of
Mhm.
transactionalism.
Right.
That I saw it as coming from perception, but now that I'm talking, I'm thinking, well, if you want to take something into account, yes, you need to perceive it, but there's got to be some really intentional component there. So I don't know, maybe
Mm.
that's what
Yeah.
he's getting at with that.
So in some sense, prehension is his attempt to generalize what we mean by perception so that it can apply beyond the human and even beyond the living realm to how, an electron takes in the field,
Mm-hmm.
the electron prehends the field.
Mm-hmm.
It feels the field. It's and that, yeah, I think in TI there aren't really particles. There aren't electrons really. There are excitations in the field.
Yeah, they're not really localized little hunks of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And prehension has a vector character, Whitehead says. And, so much of his metaphysics is just, he's generalizing from two directions, actually, not only from human experience, but from electromagnetic theory.
Hmm.
And so he wants, and he wants his account of human experience to, in some sense, be analogous to how uh, electromagnetism operates, just as he wants electromagnetism to be describable in terms that we're used
Hmm.
to describing human experience in terms of, right? And he's also so he's drawing on he studied with one of Maxwell's students at Cambridge. Forgetting his name right now, but that's his home base, in terms of understanding
Mm-hmm.
everything.
Okay.
But he also studied William James's psychology very closely, and James has this account of feeling and the felt transition between moments of our stream of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And James develops what he calls radical empiricism, which, unlike classical empiricism, would allow us to take our own experience into account,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
take relations into account, really. And the James defines a feeling as, in its most generic sense, this transition between moments. And Whitehead thinks that that account of transition in terms of feeling that for James is psychological can also apply to understanding of physical transition.
Mm.
And
Okay.
rather than using feeling is a synonym for prehension, but he develops the term prehension specifically to avoid people complaining about anthropomorphizing electrons that
Right.
they prehend, but that's basically what we mean when we say we feel our environment, um, or when we feel possibilities, because there are conceptual prehensions as well. And I think in the case of an
Mm-hmm.
electron, we might be more actually talking about conceptual prehensions of the field because it's a field of potentia, not an actual space-time thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that helps. I think of prehension as more active. Well, you said it has a vector character. And
mhm.
so I guess the term feeling for me, it sounds sort of passive. It sounds,
Sure.
yeah, but so maybe this is just kind of a semantic quibble and, maybe that's why he really went with prehension.
Prehension. Yeah, prehension
Yeah,
has more of
because
that connotation of grasping,
right,
Where-
taking into account, so there is that intentionality. So, yeah, okay, so I see that. I see the point of that now. So, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sometimes I just, there words have so many different connotations and contexts and and again, you have to be careful when presenting, I have to be careful when presenting my ideas, especially to physicists, because again, if you use a word like feeling, that the eyes will glaze over and they will head for the door.
Yeah. Um, well, I hesitate to give you another paper to read, but there's one I wrote on that's called Physics Within the Bounds of Feeling Alone, where,
Hmm.
provocative title, but I'm trying to really explain the work that the concept of prehension can do for uh, developing the philosophy of nature, wherein physics would make more sense in terms of being consistent with our human experience.
Uh-huh.
And my main target in that paper is Sean Carroll. Um,
Ah.
it's a bit polemical, but so is he. But he's one of the few
Mm-hmm.
physicists that's actually respectful of philosophy, I think, even if I don't agree with his philosophy
Hmm.
of nature, he at least is conversant with some of the main issues in philosophy and will not dismiss entirely the role of philosophers in thinking about nature, which someone
Mm-hmm.
like Neil deGrasse Tyson does as often as he possibly can.
Right. And Sam
Uh,
Harris, I don't know. I don't
yeah,
know. Sam Harris wants to have it both ways. He's very materialist and actualist and
right.
wants to be a meditator. And anyway.
So, um, yeah, I might send you that paper, you know,
Yeah, sure. No, I could take a look. Yeah.
and I have to run now, but I think this is a great beginning to
Okay.
working some of this stuff out.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, let's continue. I mean, maybe we can,
absolutely.
I want to keep reading through your book. I'll send you this additional article, and when we feel like we have enough questions for each other again, we can sync up on Zoom and do this again.
Sounds good. Okay.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for spending the time with me and the tutelage in Whitehead is very helpful.
Well, absolutely. And I'm learning so much from you as well, clarifying some confusions about how quantum theory works. So
I'm
thank you.
glad.
It's very productive for me.
Great.
All right, Ruth.
All right. Till next
I'll
time.
I'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks. Take care.